encourage that we take our seats and we start again with our second speaker. So I'm happy to introduce Sjoerd van Tuinen, who is an associate professor of philosophy at the Erasmus University Rotterdam. He is editor of many books, including Deleuze and the Fold, A Critical Reader, Speculative Art Histories, and Art History After Deleuze and Guattari, and is currently finalizing his monograph called Matter, Manner, Idea, Deleuze and Mannerism, and another monograph actually called Ressentiment. Ressentiment, Pedagogy of a Concept. Van Tuinen is a co-founder of the Erasmus Institute for Public Knowledge, where he coordinates a project on austerity politics. So please welcome Sjoerd van Tuinen.
Thank you, Vera, for inviting me to this hugely sophisticated conference. Thanks also to Poltak, the previous speaker, for formulating the political challenge of finding consensus instead of similarities, which is precisely going to be the subject of my talk. My talk is going to consist of 3 parts. The first is called From Critique to Care. Second part is called Good Sense and Common Sense. And the third part is called Towards a Minor Philosophy, Leibniz's Mannerism. I wish that I could break all habits, that I could see anew, hear anew, feel anew. Habit spoils our philosophy. It's a quote from Georg Christoph Lichtenberg, who makes the familiar gesture of the critical enlightener, who reveals a polemical worldview in which tradition and customs are perceived as impinging on reason. It is echoed by George Berkeley, who thought a philosophy of common sense is contradictory and preferred his own solipsistic worldview. Both philosophers are, of course, indebted to Descartes and his method of doubt, which makes the bifurcation of common sense and reason, in philosophy. From then on, almost all modern philosophy would be founded on the bracketing of natural experience, even in those cases where it sought a subsequent return to common sense. In its desire to eliminate all inherited opinions and dogmas and to begin anew, modern philosophy follows up on the radical separation of being and appearance introduced by modern science. Eppure si muove. Galilei allegedly uttered, after being forced to recant before the Inquisition, his belief that the earth moves around the sun. It has become emblematic both of the great narrative of the Copernican revolution, which signals the destruction of the geocentric order of the ancient cosmos, and for science's rejection of any compromise with what it deems unscientific. Marking the victory of one man against 1,000 rhetoricians, politicians, and theologians, it reveals the polemical nature of the passions that have inspired science until today. From Isaac Newton to Max Planck and Stephen Hawking, there exists a physicist's faith in a hierarchy that declares physical reality the only real one, with physics at the summit of rational knowledge, and that as a consequence renders science intrinsically immune to the possibility of methodological and cultural peace. If for the ancients the aim of knowledge was to save the phenomena, for the moderns it is to discover the hidden functional apparatus behind them. Now today this critical passion appears to be strangely outdated. Does it not rely on a media image of science that couldn't be further removed from the practical concerns of so-called cutting-edge physicists and philosophers today, such as research funding, social outreach, competition, and the bureaucratic division of labor? Indeed, doesn't this image of the martyr for truth first of all legitimate the parasitism of capital, which is not only currently destroying the less hard sciences such as the humanities, but also has already reinvented it as them as a kind of techno-science, those sciences it feeds on. In any case, in their pretension to universality and denial of the validity of claims and practices other than their own, modern philosophy and science seem to have been overtaken by reality. They share in the fate of their vilified nemesis, common sense. Cognitive commons such as ideas, imagination, culture, or public space have become more and more enclosed and co-opted by intellectual property regimes. With critical reflection now being ubiquitous and typical of all social practices, from our roles as employee or husbands or citizens, to ongoing monitoring, evaluating, accrediting, and accounting, the element of suspicion seems to have become a liability and a caricature of itself. As a consequence, and here I side with Latour, I suppose, critique has run out of steam. Critical reason used to be a function of autonomy and an expression of collective courage. Now it is a function of the knowledge economy and an expression of fearful individualism. Hannah Arendt once said that it is the mode of thought of lonely mass man. Today at stake is our sense of the common, and with it our sense of realness or groundedness. After all, respect for good evidence and standards of well-conducted inquiry are not exclusive to science and philosophy, but they belong to empirical inquiry of every kind, including that of judges, historians, investigative journalists, and private detectives. Moreover, they are key to what seems traditionally opposed to science, politics. Arendt gives the famous example of the statesman who is surrounded by an army of experts who contradict each other, but whose advice he nonetheless cannot do without. On what grounds can he judge between them? Only on the hypothetical presupposition of common sense, which remains mysterious as to its origin, but becomes manifest in the act of judging itself. So ever since Aristotle, common sense has been understood in two ways at once. It is the sixth sense that guarantees that the five senses all have the same object, so-called sensus communis in Kant, and it is the intersubjective context that bestows this object with identity and meaning, the world, if you wish, as Hannah Arendt would call it. In both aspects, common sense has an uncritical, inarticulate, and preliminary mode of existence. It is the implied vital premise of both our actions and our feelings, perceptions, and higher cognitions. But it never becomes explicit for itself. As Kant says, common sense knows no generality of rules or understanding, only of experience. Unlike opinion, then, it is a background feeling, and as such, it does not need to be defined. But this, of course, is precisely why it is defenseless against critical assaults. Is common sense not some kind of urdoxa that illegitimately takes over as soon as critical reason sleeps? Isn't it the faculty of obsolete humanist modes of valuation? And isn't it precisely the kind of middle ground that stifles political dissensus? In fact, none of these problems are essential to common sense. As the contemporary crisis of common sense shows, common sense is not an original opinion and cannot be taken for granted. It is not an outdated artifact of humanism, because it is precisely what is missing today when it is a matter of maintaining some sort of coherence between humans and non-human critters and artificial forms of intelligence. And despite current depoliticizing tendencies of political correctness and neoliberal post-politics, it certainly isn't some kind of neutral space for civilized encounters. On the contrary, what we have instead of common sense is a battlefield for climate wars, culture wars, and science wars. We have as our dominant mode of intelligence a pervasive skepticism, skeptical realism if you want, that passes for common sense, but in reality couldn't be further removed from it. In other words, there are certainly dangers and risks involved with common sense, but as such they need not be criticized. On the contrary, they need care. Like habit, common sense is a precarious faculty that cannot be realized but only actualized. It is a domain of potentiality that exists and persists only if it is repeatedly performed in the coming together of different perspectives. In other words, when public interests come into play. Like a habit too, it is a power which is both entropic or has both entropic and negentropic tendencies. Instead of being opposed to thought, then common sense, or rather the absence of common sense today, obliges thought. Thought, here understood as a dialectic between thinking and feeling, an art of articulation that is emotionally intelligent, and in which words don't just reflect practice, but also perform the potentiality of that practice. So, second part, good sense and common sense. Drawing on a conceptual shift in the work of Kant, and hinted at by Hannah Arendt, namely the replacement of Gemeinsinn, common sense, by gesunder Menschenverstand, good sense. We can define the critical gestures of modernity as a series of attempts to privatize common sense as if it were a property of good sense. Good sense would then be that innate and undoubtable affinity with and upright orientation on the truth, of which Descartes had already said that it is the most fairly distributed thing in the world. Today, these gestures are typically mimicked by populist politicians who appeal to common experience or popular will. In such cases, as John Dewey writes, what is averred to be implicit reliance upon what is given in common experience is likely to be merely an appeal to prejudice to gain support for some fanaticism or defense for some relic of conservative tradition, which is beginning to be questioned. But of course, these fanatical gestures are not limited to populist politics. They can already be found in modern science, which of course bursts the bound of common sense experience, but not without extrapolating from it the explicit aim of establishing a new sense that it claims to be no less evident and common. So from the equally unreflective perspective of good sense, there seems to be a common sense that is shared by science, differentialism on the one hand, and anti-intellectualist common sensism on the other. And it is this good sense that sustains both the illusion of unlimited scientific process and the illusion that common sense remains unaffected by it. And this is why critiques of common sense, say the criticisms of folklore psychology by Paul and Patricia Churchland, or the criticisms of folk politics in the accelerationist movement, never really lead to a new kind of thought. As Hannah Arendt puts it, the modern scientist is someone, quote, who constantly destroys authentic semblances without, however, destroying his own sense of reality. For in place of the semblances it encounters, it merely posits its own, precisely to the extent that it cannot put itself at stake in the encounter with others. Critical reason thus effectively absorbs common sense and good sense. Now, in philosophy, this colonization of common sense can easily be recognized in the fathers of modern philosophy, Descartes and Kant. In Descartes, common sense is the necessary complement of good sense, such that it is always certain that we all see and speak about the same piece of wax, for example. So common sense guarantees the identity of the object, whereas good sense the identity of the subject as a thinker. The same goes for Kant. Based on his lifetime engagement with Scottish common sense philosophy, he combines the two Aristotelian meanings of common sense in his notion of Gemeinsinn, which he defines as our feeling of being alive. Common sense is both the pleasure enjoyed in the free interplay of our cognitive faculties and the claim to universality whenever we make an epistemic, moral, or aesthetic judgment. In other words, the universal communicability of our feelings or state of mind goes together with the capacity to take the other's place. The first guarantees realness of representations, the second, the teaching, recognition, and description involved in ordinary communication. And thus for Kant there is, quote, good reason to presuppose a common sense. Without a community or public space for reason, the gesunder Menschenverstand, or good sense, could not emancipate itself from its self-imposed tutelage. But the price, of course, of this universalization of common sense as a transcendental presupposition of critical good sense appears to be precisely the loss of the empiricist care for common sense that characterized the Scottish Enlighteners. A quote from Kant, "There are two things which I must deprecate." Quote from the Prolegomena. First, trifling about probability and conjecture, and secondly, decision by the magic wand of so-called common sense. And thus Kant repeats the foundational break of philosophy with common sense in the name of good sense, at the same time that he betrays it and retrieves common sense as the necessary complement of good sense. He simply cannot do without it because the price, as he puts it, would be its replacement with a merely logical, private sense that he calls madness. When the faculties get fragmented, in other words, perception, when memory, perception, and imagination become indistinguishable, then we are left with a good sense with no sense of realness. Now, something similar also happens in the phenomenological and hermeneutical traditions to which Hannah Arendt is indebted. Here the question whether common sense is a given a priori faculty or something that is socio-culturally acquired through long processes of habituation, this question tends to be solved by positing the faculty of judgment and human existence as co-original and in mutual presupposition. Reason enough for someone like Gilles Deleuze to argue that good sense and common sense constitute the two halves of a dogmatic and orthodox image of thought. The unity of the other faculties in the subject, who is naturally oriented towards truth, I think, and the recognition of the object of thought as the identical between the faculties and other subjects. This is a piece of wax. Deleuze, through a radicalization of the critical gesture of modern philosophy, was the one who took the Kantian concept of madness to its logical end. The genesis of sense lies in nonsense, in the destruction of both good sense and common sense. Hence, in a way, Deleuze gives the ultimate articulation of critical reason, or what he calls, together with Nietzsche, total critique, under the label, of course, of capitalism and schizophrenia. But as I already indicated at the beginning, today, say in the Anthropocene, the problem has changed. Less a given than a possibility, common sense is currently being undermined from all sides. Words such as complexity or crisis barely grasp the irreversibility of this demise and the power of composition that may truly mark the end of an era that used to define itself through universal progress, in other words, through good sense. And what this means can be seen when you look at the capitalist world system, which nowadays is no longer capable of sophistication. Perhaps for the first time in human history, the global economy is shifting to energy sources that are less energy efficient. Once we take into account the so-called biophysical externalities, in particular the depletion of the capacity of existing ecosystems to handle waste, there has probably been no surplus value over more than a decade now, at least in the developed world. Bitcoin alone, based on a consensual algorithm, could well push global warming above 2 degrees Celsius, which suggests that automatization won't help us either. As a consequence, capitalism is rapidly hardening its disruptive focus to short-term profit maximization with little or no apparent interest in what's common. Besides thermodynamic entropy producing climate change, there is habitat destruction, welfare destruction, and a wave of mass extinction, but also the informational entropy producing cultural destruction, behavioral standardization, and fake news. In other words, stupidity. Stupidity defined as the becoming rigid, dogmatic, authoritarian, and obsolete of knowledge, and the retreat exactly of common sense. We have a crisis of articulation, in other words, that in the end doesn't only affect common sense, but also critical or good sense. So now I go to part 3, towards a minor philosophy, Leibniz's mannerism. Traditionally, there's a special role for philosophy in the invention of new forms of articulation, which nowadays I think are inseparable from other technology-induced forms of articulation called artificial intelligence. After all, common sense also has no naturalistic determination, as if it were in large measure the common possession of all normal people using a common language and objective ways of perceiving the world. On the contrary, common sense itself must also be conceived of as artificial as it is unlikely. And this raises the question of a more technical understanding of wisdom or reason, and a new mode of reason which is no longer that of critique and revolves around an art and a care for our articulations. And here a number of propositions have been made. Michel Serres, of course, is a very prominent figure in this way. I'm a fan also of Whitehead, who wrote a little text called The Function of Reason, where he defines reason as the self-discipline of the creative element in life. So it's kind of a negentropic. Reason has kind of negentropic functionality, it has to produce some kind of noetic difference. And so what the work of people like Serre and Whitehead suggests is that beyond cybernetic illusions of mastery and control, there is such a thing as care as a model of conceiving of algorithmic performativity. For example, when it's set to work at the scale of the biosphere. And here, of course, we could do a lot of talk about coding, but I know little to nothing about coding, so I won't. Instead, I'm going to stick to philosophy, which I think has the task nowadays, and Serre formulates it that way, Whitehead does it too, of civilizing our abstractions, the abstractions we live by. Whitehead says, on the one hand, common sense is the faculty of benumbing repression. It's there, it kills everything, it kills difference, it kills thought. But, he says, it is part of the special sciences to modify common sense. Philosophy, however, is the welding of imagination and common sense into a restraint upon specialists and also into an enlargement of their imagination. So in this sense, common sense becomes somehow the ultimate ground or the finality of what we do or what we articulate. Imagination is a means to augment or enrich common sense. It's a matter of composition, of articulation and sophistication in what I would describe as the informal dimension between good sense and common sense. I think in the dialectical tradition, this informal dimension between good sense and common sense is called the idea. Especially there where common sense is acknowledged to be absent. So the main philosophical technology for articulating and enriching common sense is the dialectic. And the task of the dialectic, I would say, is a perversion of good sense as common sense. A kind of revirtualization of good sense as common sense. And that's why it is so sophisticated and full of cunning. Now, of old, this project of philosophy to vindicate common sense is called the encyclopedia, right? And there's two versions of the encyclopedia. There's a pessimist version, which I find in Leibniz or Schelling. And then there's an optimist version of the encyclopedia, optimist with regard to good sense, that I find in Hegel. So in the phenomenology of spirit, we see how Hegel traverses the path of the linear self-overcoming of common sense as good sense. We see that common sense is full of false abstractions and the received obviousness of common sense needs to be criticized, and this happens, of course, from a linearly progressing form of collective becoming conscious called spirit. And so the encyclopedia for Hegel is the complete self-understanding of spirit, or human spirituality. Leibniz's encyclopedia is very different. It is based on a decentering of good sense. It doesn't start from common sense, because there is no common sense to start from. You start with a decentering of good sense. The monadology, one of the most extravagant metaphysical constructions ever conceived, the world is composed of monads, spiritual entities that have neither doors nor windows. Each is a world on its own, so there's no common sense. Each is a version of the world. So what Leibniz does in a way is he multiplies good sense. Each monad has its own good sense. He multiplies good sense in order to have them, all these different good senses melt somehow, to have them inter-express in the end a common world, common sense. This means that Leibniz is much more hermetic. The encyclopedia for him is an art of implicit overlaps of forms of knowledge that navigate a clair-obscur structure, the clair-obscur structure of common sense. I think this is also what Michel Serre has developed in many places in much more technical ways than I can. When Serre, for example, describes hermeticism as this, that to wrench something from the shadows is often to destroy it. This is what good sense does, what critical sense, critical reason does. You wrench something from you explicate, but by explicating, it loses its it runs out of steam. While to place something in the shadows is often to protect it. This is a notion that you will also find in Deleuze when he talks about an ethics of intensive quantities, where you can never explicate too much. You have to always take care of the implications of whatever you say. This is what it means to articulate a virtual. It's the condition under which we have to articulate the virtual common sense. So Leibniz is a kind of Hermes, the agent of rapprochements. Leibniz calls himself Pacidius, peacemaker. He's interested in crafting networks of knowledge that eliminate war, not eliminate heterogeneity. He lets himself be inspired by Lullism, by Athanasius Kircher, and in the end he wants to arrive at the universal characteristic, right? A universal language, or a perfect art of combinations, by which he wants to articulate and construct that common sense that is not there. So like Hegel, Leibniz is a philosopher of order. Where there is chaos, there order must be. But the emphasis in his work, contrary to Hegel, where the emphasis is on logic, and Leibniz is on creativity. Creativity, because the order, which is apparently everywhere lacking, is kind of waiting for him to materialize. It's waiting for us to materialize. And I think this is precisely what makes him infinitely more sophisticated than Hegel. As an engineer, Leibniz designed windmills. As a mathematician, he invented the binary system and laid the foundations, together with Newton, well, simultaneously with Newton, not exactly together, of differential calculus. As a scientist, he founded an academy, proposed networks. As a diplomat, very important, he was a diplomat. He proposed plans for religious reconciliation. And then he comes up with this universal characteristic, which is not a theoretical construct, but it's meant to solve practical problems, and should not be understood as a kind of one-dimensional language, the wet dream of analytical philosophy, but as an inclusive language, as a language for infinite representation. So, if Friedrich Kittler once showed how communication technologies arise out of the First and Second World Wars, something similar happens with Leibniz after the 30-year war and the failure of Latin as a kind of universal alphabet. We need a new universal language for communication. And in Leibniz, this means that we shift from the alphabet to number as a paradigm, and permutations, variations, and combinations of numbers. It's a mathesis universalis. In other words, what Leibniz wants to do, and he says this literally, he wants to improve human spirit, human capacity to think by 100% artificial means. It's not that the world is deemed mathematical, as in Galilei, but he bets on the relevance of mathesis to the world, in a way, for how the world is going to develop, how it's going to become. Leibniz knows well there is no communication without noise. And of course he believed that each controversy could be settled on the basis of calculation, but the sophistication of his approach, I would say, is a matter of betting on this relevance of mathematics to the world in becoming, where the finality is not even knowledge, or something that is conceivable in the image of mathematics, but peace or harmony. So what he wants to do, in a way, is not denaturalize language, create a superior form of language, but really, enrich it, improve it. That's why he also says, like, on the one hand, we need one language for all. On the other hand, nothing should be expressed which is not understandable in colloquial language. So there's always these two things together. That's why there's really a dialectic between them. There's always the feedback loop of whatever artificiality you create to the finality to the imperative of communication. So Leibniz's ironism goes back, of course, to humanist theologians such as Erasmus and Melanchthon, but it also has an aesthetic sophistication. There's an aesthetic to this artificiality, which is inspired by the great 16th discourses on social comportment of Castiglione and Balthasar Gracian. Now, on the one hand, you have the brutal reality in Europe of class struggle, religious wars, Turkish invasions. But on the other hand, you have the development of a trade bourgeoisie, of urbanization, and of new techniques of government, and, crucially, an individualist culture of extraordinariness and excellence. And out of this mannerist world of the 16th century, there emerges a whole mannerist world out of the desire to kind of civilize the contradictions of the 16th century. And that's basically what happens with Leibniz. Just as the Council of Trent sets the terms for the liturgical discipline of priestly etiquette and protocols that effectuate the real presence of Christ in the sacrament, there also appears a whole civil culture of social presence, of effective being in society. In a way, with mannerism, war itself acquires an aesthetic destiny, becoming a question of art and technique. Rules of decorum are not based on generic conventions, but they are projective and conjectural, giving access to new imperceptible forces, new tendencies, new forms of coming together. And it's also Leibniz's interest again in Lulism, in magic, whole symbolism. They all serve as transformative gestures instead of consolidating gestures, as ways of becoming other. And this emphasis on how things become rather than why things are what they are enables us to read Leibniz as a minor key philosophy, in the same sense that Deleuze and Guattari speak of a minor literature or a minor science. Major and minor refer to modes of thinking and feeling, whereas it is easy to discover in Spinoza a major key thinker, someone who had an optimistic conception of the power of truth and rationality, whose heritage is generally claimed by contemporary enlighteners from all over the political and scientific spectrum. But you could say a little bit the same about Hegel. Leibniz's so-called optimism is in fact a much more pessimistic and diplomatic one, because a minor rationality has no model. We should say with Deleuze and Guattari, it only has another possible world. Right? Other forms of another rationality must be possible. That's kind of the demand, the claim that Leibniz makes. A world to come. Perhaps it was this sophisticated pessimism, typical of someone torn between the role of the Renaissance mage and Baroque court intellectual, that led him to demand that philosophy should never break with common sense, or what he called established sentiments. I quote, "A metaphysics should be written with accurate definitions and demonstrations, but nothing should be demonstrated in it apart from that which does not clash too much with established sentiments. For in that way, this metaphysics can be accepted, and once it has been approved, then, if people examine it more deeply later, they themselves will draw the necessary consequences." So from common sense, we pass to good sense. In this metaphysics, it will be useful for there to be added here and there the authoritative utterances of great men who have reasoned in a similar way, especially when these utterances contain something that seems to have some possible relevance to the illustration of a view. So he wants to be everybody's friend in a way. He's all-inclusive proposition. And with this demand, he clearly runs the risks of a much too clever lack of resistance, a demand of good sense. But at the same time, it is also, and here I rely on Isabelle Stenger's Leibniz reading, it is a specific constraint or an obligation as opposed to a demand that forbids us to judge over what does not meet up the model's standard, and that enables us to take responsibility for our present becomings. Not breaking with established sentiments means saving and redressing them much, this is an analogy made by Stengers, much as a mathematician respects the constraints that give meaning and interest to his problem. A quote from Stengers: "The problem designated by the Leibnizian constraint never to break with common sense. Ties together truth and becoming, and assigns to the statement of what one believes to be true the responsibility not to hinder becoming, not to collide with established sentiments so as to try to open them to what their established identity led them to refuse, combat, or misunderstand. End of quote. Likewise, in mathematics, an invention does not destroy past definitions and questions, past forms of good sense, if you wish, but conserves them as a particular aspect of a transformed definition, leading to new questions. In other words, common sense remains a part of the grounds on which we reason, and this inseparability of reason and passion is far from an anti-intellectualist or anti-rationalist attitude. On the contrary, I would say it is good sense that risks stupefying thought, as it can easily make us indifferent to its concrete efficacy, as ready-made in the form of ready-made reasons that make us act and judge in one way or another. And it is therefore in the same way that the major sentiment of truth in, for example, evolutionary theory, should never be an excuse for the irreparable loss of species in the name of the further progress of life. Similarly, the major sentiment of acceleration in Marxist theory does not acquit us of the responsibility for those who get left behind. Because here necessary reason or good sense no longer suffices. What we need is a whole new sensibility. I'm almost reaching the end. 2 minutes, 3? What we need in a way is a belief in the world, as Deleuze would say, and belief in common sense, even if it doesn't actually exist. Belief in the world for Leibniz is never a generic passion, a passion that belongs at the same time to everyone, to no one in particular, but it has to be engendered anew, percolating from one singular case or event to the next. So the new task of reason or of thought in form of care is to engender belief, and that is to slow down the immediate appearance of seemingly self-evident reasons. In the theodicy, for example, Sextus' inclination to put into question and condemn God's capacities of judgment with respect to his personal destiny, to rape Lucretia and cause civil war, and thus to condemn the world as created by God. Instead, we need reason to situate one in the presence of precarious beginnings that can actually make us think and then decide for what would be the best for possible world. In this sense, Leibniz formulates a slogan, the only slogan he ever formulated, calculemus, let us calculate. And in the reading that Stengers gives, and I think Serre would also agree, it's precisely about the construction of the us that has to calculate, which is not given. There is no us that calculates. It's through calculation that we have to arrive at the subject of calculation. So to be converted to the world or to common sense is to become part of the collective fabrication of new forms of subjectivity, of common grounds tending towards new modes of thinking and feeling. Leibniz consistently abstained from alienating the people by telling them that their reasons consist only of folk psychology, for example. And precisely because such a depersonalization would divest them of the reasons that claim to account for where they are. At the same time, this also explains the complaint of Leibniz's contemporaries, the Hanoverian people of faith, who ascribed him the moniker that resembled his name, Leuvenix, or Glaubenix, I'm not sure what the original version is, because they discovered that he cunningly saved their convictions, but at the cost of depriving them of the power to contradict others. So that's Leibniz's sophistication. It's the recalcitrance to speak in the name of either the love of truth or in the name of the relativity of opinion, but something that articulates through what Stengers calls a humor of truth, humeur de la vérité, a variation on amour de la vérité. And so in terms of method, since we're talking about method here, what I take from Leibniz as a method of relating to common sense, method is not a way to get to a certain point as quickly as possible, but a way of maximizing friction in the name of what Leibniz calls peace. So efficiency here takes a wholly new form. Crucially, there is no economy to Leibniz's thought. Only good sense has an economy. That's why there are interpretations of Leibniz as a proto-market thinker, as a liberal market thinker. Think of a guy like John Elster. I would say there's no economy to Leibniz, but an ecology. And it's an ecology based on minimal demands and maximal obligations. And the whole calculus of minima and maxima, I think, should be reinterpreted in those sense. Isabelle Stengers, I'm concluding now, once suggested that metaphysics, for example, this bizarre construct called the monadology, metaphysics for Leibniz was essentially a form of politesse. Contrary to a deduction of the world from first principles, it is precisely the attempt to minimize requirements and maximize obligations. And I take this to mean that the minimization of requirements is achieved through a radical decentering of the theoretical point of view with respect to the diverging interests of the world. An operation, in other words, associated with the empiricist constraint to always begin from the middle rather than from ourselves. Commencer par le milieu, as Deleuze calls it. And then the maximizations of obligations is achieved through the all-inclusive ambition of rationalism. Everything must have a reason. There is a number for everything or idea in the world. Even if this means turning reason into a convention or a completely artificial protocol. Reasons, after all, are not simply given in nature, but must be rendered or restored or returned. Not to render the world accountable to the subject, as Heidegger thought, but in order to take responsibility for the rationality of the world, that is, for its common composition.